recession, people are familiar with, economists use the term all the time, and it has a numeric definition. It's 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There are a couple other factors that go in, but that's the basic rule. So 2 consecutive quarters, 2 or more of declining GDP, that's a recession. And of course, we had a recession, at least in the United States, actually probably most of the world, in the first half of 2020. First quarter and second quarter were both down, and there's the recession. So the third quarter, growth was quite strong. It didn't come all the way back compared to what was lost in the first half, but it was strong. So that you could argue that the recession was over by July of 2020. We have a group in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a private group of economists, but they're the official scorekeepers, if you will, about recessions. They did declare a recession started in the first quarter. They haven't said it's over, but it's very likely that they'll reach that conclusion. Depression is different. Economists, first of all, don't like the word depression because it's more subjective. It's not as quantitative. It involves a lot of psychological, behavioral variables, if you will. But depressions are real. They happen, and we're in one now, but economists just don't like to talk about it. They've kind of banned the D word, as I put it, from the vocabulary. So a lot of people assume that if a recession is 2 quarters or more of declining GDP and depression sounds worse, that must be 10 quarters of declining GDP, some really horrible economic outcome. And that's not the definition. You can actually have growth in a depression, but the point is it's depressed growth. It's growth below trend, below potential. And for that matter, I think you could make a good case that we've been in a depression since 2008. You look at the recovery. Okay, we had a recovery from 2009 to 2019. It was the longest expansion in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest expansion in U.S. history. The average annual growth during that entire 10-year period was about 2.2%, whereas in all recoveries post-1980, the average recovery was 3.2%. So there's an example where you had growth, but it was a full percentage point below trend, below what we had done previously. If you go back even further to the end of World War II forward, average recoveries were closer to 4.5%. So if that's the potential in a developed economy and you're growing at 2.2, that's depressed growth. We can leave the definition of what happened for those 10 years for another day. But now the point is we've had a technical recession. We may be approaching another technical recession, the first back-to-back recession since 1980. But that aside, we're in a period of depressed growth. We won't recover 2009 levels of output until late this year at the earliest, maybe probably early 2022. And this will persist for not just years, but for perhaps a decade or more. This will be intergenerational in its impact. So that's what I mean by depression. I did an interview the other day, and I said this could be or was appeared to be worse than the Great Depression. And the person I was interviewing with said, well, hold on, the Great Depression, they recited some statistics since it hasn't been that bad yet. I said, well, you're missing the point. Those figures from the Great Depression took 4 years to play out, or in some ways 10 years if you go all the way up to 1940. We've only been in this for about a year, so let's call me next year, the year after, see where things stand. But in my view, we're in a new Great Depression. It will persist. Will have intergenerational effects, and will be very, very difficult to get out of. Even periods of growth will be very weak growth. People between the ages of 25 and 54, prime working age, there are over 10 million of them who don't have jobs, but they're not counted as unemployed because they're not looking for jobs. But the point I make is, well, if you're a bartender in a town where every bar is closed, what's the point of looking for a job? Maybe you can move to Phoenix, Arizona and put solar panels together, but that's not very likely. The point is that labor force participation rate never gets to 100%. It never gets over 70%. There are good reasons for some people not to have jobs. You could be a student, you could be a homemaker. As I said, there are other reasons. But when it drops that much, you have a large pool. And by the way, I've been speaking of this for a long time. Other analysts have as well. Jay Powell, chairman of the Fed, mentioned it in a speech last week. So it's even beginning to sink in at the Fed a little bit. And he said what we're saying right now, which is if you take the able-bodied Americans who don't have jobs but not looking for them and add them to the unemployed list, that number, percentage number goes up to about 12 or 15%. And that is a depression level unemployment rate. This is, by the way, the evidence is overwhelming from many studies, both international and comparing states in the United States, that lockdowns do not work to stop the spread of the virus. They're very good at destroying economies. They don't stop the spread of the virus. We've seen, for example, in the United States, we have 50 states. Well, we never had a national lockdown. It went state by state, governor by governor, in some cases mayor by mayor. So we have a pretty good, we have a diverse set of experiences. So there are places like California and New York that had extreme lockdowns. You had a place like Florida, which had more of a moderate lockdown. You have a state like South Dakota, which had no lockdown. The governor said, wash your hands, social distance. If you don't want to go out to a restaurant, that's fine, but we're not going to tell you you can't. We'll make it voluntary. The same thing was true around the world. We saw extreme lockdowns in Italy and Spain and France in the first wave in 2020. We had some countries that did moderate lockdowns. I would put Sweden in that category. And some countries that at least initially had no lockdowns. And Brazil is an example of that. So we now have the data. We have the 50 states. We have 30 or more countries around the world. And what the data shows clearly is that there is no correlation between lockdown policy and the spread of the disease. Or put in more statistical terms, the lockdown policy has no material impact on the spread of the virus. Whatever policy you pursue, you get pretty much the same results in terms of caseloads and fatalities. I did another interview earlier today. It was a large international audience, a lot of people from Asia, and one question said, New Zealand had a very severe lockdown and the spread of the disease declined. And couldn't the United States learn from New Zealand? I said, no. I said, I don't doubt that you had a lockdown. I know you had a lockdown. I know the disease declined, but it would have declined anyway. And that's really the point. And we see that from a lot of data. So lockdowns don't help, but they do destroy economies. And that's what we've seen in New York. Now, they say they're easing up, but let's define that. So restaurants can have indoor seating, but only at 25% of capacity. Sports arenas can have fans in the seats, but only at 10% of capacity, and only if you bring a recent test result with you, like a little QR code on your iPhone, etc. That's tantamount to a lockdown. They say they're easing up, but they're not really easing up. The impact on the economy is devastating, and it's not just a question of a business shutting down and then reopening, 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later. A lot of these businesses don't survive. Perhaps half of small businesses are going out of business permanently. Those job losses are not temporary, they're permanent. The owners of, let's say a restaurant or bar, salon, boutique shop, they're closing their doors, breaking their leases, selling their equipment at bargain basement prices, and the workers are never getting their jobs back. Now, eventually those people will get jobs, and perhaps the restaurant owner will move to a different state, move to Florida, and open a new restaurant next year. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but I'm saying it's the end of millions of small businesses, and that's about half the economy in the U.S. So New York, streets are pretty much abandoned. Crime in the subway is, people are afraid to walk into the subways. The tax base is eroded. There's graffiti everywhere. Stores are still boarded up, some of them. And the city's depopulating. We, in the United States, when you move, I suppose it's true in other countries around the world, when you move, you can go to the post office and put in a notice of your new address, and that way the post office will forward your mail. So mail coming to the old address will be sent to the new address. Through October, from January to October 2020, there were 300,000 of those mail change addresses filed in New York. It's a public record. Well, there's one per household. So if you assume an average household of 3 people, it could be more or less in a particular case, that's upwards of 1 million people leaving New York. And that was through October. I don't doubt that number is significantly higher today. It's only a city of 8 million, so you have 1 million people moving out. Cities are the greatest wealth creation, wealth generating agglomerations in the history of civilization, and they're depopulating. So you're destroying the wealth generating potential of the cities. And it's not just New York, it's Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Baltimore, and elsewhere. And a lot of this is irreversible. When a business or an individual moves, you don't move back 6 months later. I mean, you could, I guess, but one of the questions you have to ask is, okay, they're leaving New York and the other cities I mentioned. Where are they going? Well, we know they're going to Miami, Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona, and Boise, Idaho, and Denver, among other cities. So, interesting times. I guess the point I would make is that depressions are intergenerational in their impact, and we'll be feeling the effects of this for not 30 weeks or 30 months, but for 30 years.